I can't hold. Look, baby, it's up. You don't need to pass him up. Somebody better get on it.
5 guards stand watch as the condemned men of C-Pod take their daily exercise.
That's me. Come on, baby.
Willie Turner and another inmate approach an officer, telling him they want to go back in early. One of the men claims he has a knee injury. The other says he wants to use the restroom. This is against prison policy. State Police investigator James Lettner.
It was a mistake to allow those 2 individuals to go back separately from the others. If one inmate went back, then they all were supposed to go back. And the reason for that is that by taking those 2 inmates back early, it took 2 of the correctional officers off the recreation yard and back to the cell area, lessening the number of eyes that were available to watch the remaining inmates as they returned from recreation to their cells.
Now the ratio of guards to prisoners is disrupted. In the yard, there are only 3 officers left to watch over the remaining inmates.
All right, guys, let's do it. Time to go in. Let's do it.
The other inmates are escorted to their cells. The guards seem unconcerned they are outnumbered 3 to 1.
The correctional officers assumed that nothing was going to happen, that everything was fine, that they had a secure operation, and that they simply didn't have to follow these rules.
Had they been more vigilant, they would have noticed a plan is already in motion. A plan whose success or failure depends on one man, Earl Clanton. The plan also relies on the guards' complacency. They do not bother to count heads. The inmates bunch up and start to push, distracting the officers. Unnoticed, Clanton slips into the guards' restroom. His job, to wait for a signal. A ruthless killer, Clanton was chosen as the man to make the first strike. In 1980, he stabbed an elementary school librarian 8 times in the head. He then took the belt from her coat and strangled her to death. Because they didn't count heads, the guards have no idea Clanton has disappeared. Lettner's report would later indicate this was a breach of security protocol.
It's difficult to believe that when you're dealing with individuals who have everyone murdered at least one person, and in some instances multiple murders, that the correctional officers would become complacent and feel that they didn't have to count these individuals or know where they were at every moment. It's difficult to believe that that would occur, but it did in this instance. The escapees were con artists. They were shrewd in the ways of the street and how they could get around these correctional officers. They had observed from the moment that they entered the institution that certain rules were not being followed, and it played right into their hands.
At Mecklenburg, Building 1 is broken up into 3 pods, A, B, and C. C-Pod is divided into 2 sections, with a control booth separating the sections.
Certainly. Officer Hughes, please.
The man who controlled C-Pod was Rick Hughes. Electrically activated locks give Officer Hughes control over who enters and leaves death row.
Does the control go?
Hughes tells Lettner that one of the inmates got his attention. It was Joe Giarratano, who was housed on the pod's left side. Giarratano asks Hughes to pass a book to inmate James Briley, who was on the pod's right side.
All right, I'll do it this time. Come on, come on.
Linwood Briley and his brother James received death sentences for 7 murders. In one case, they repeatedly raped a woman within earshot of her common-law husband and their 5-year-old son, then killed the 3 of them. Officer Hughes leaves the door to the control booth ajar, as the prisoners had seen him do dozens of times before. He has no idea the inmates are already arming themselves with knives.
There was a fellow by the name of Willie Turner. He was kind of a genius as far as figuring out how to make weapons from the things around him in the prison cell and how to hide them. And he would basically strip metal from around the toilets or the sides of the door or something like that and sharpen it and make a knife out of it.
Convicted of killing a jeweler in 1978 and sentenced to death, Willie Turner never finished 5th grade, but he learned to read and write in prison. He claimed to have made a key for every cell he ever occupied. The guards suspect he is behind the plan to escape. At James Briley's signal, Clanton bursts from the restroom. He hits a button in the control booth, releasing the other inmates. The prisoners take control of C-Pod in barely 3 minutes. Each of the guards relate how he had been taken hostage and stripped of his uniform. The inmates take the only defense the guards have, their nightsticks, along with their watches, rings, and money. The guards are hogtied and shackled with their own handcuffs. Blindfolded, they overhear the inmates discuss how they need to capture someone in authority. The inmates know the security procedures, and they make the system work against itself.
They got the other guards to come to Pod C simply by faking emergencies, that they needed assistance with inmate so-and-so who was not taking his medication or resisting one thing or another.
By creating the illusion of a fellow correctional officer in trouble, the inmates lure other guards into C-Pod one by one. They then capture them and take their uniforms. James Briley grabs a television set. Somehow he would have to pass it off as a bomb. Now that the inmates have control of C-Pod, they have to get out of the building. At the center of Building 1 is a main control room which controls the door to the outside. The inmates have to gain control of this room. In the main control room, Officer Smith is still waiting word from the officers dispatched to C-Pod.
Officer Smith.
Then she receives a call. It sounds like Lieutenant Johnson. He tells her a man is being sent to relieve her.
By having her supervisor, who was a hostage, call her and tell her that she would be relieved of duty by another guard. She didn't question who the guard was.
Peterson and Clanton now dressed in guards' uniforms, head for the main control room. Officer Smith has no way of knowing the officer sent to relieve her is Derek Peterson.
Come on, get down on the ground. Get down on the ground. Down. All right, there you go. What's the station here? 166.
The prisoners now have control of all the doors to Building 1. But there is only one way out of the prison compound: the sally port. James Briley forces Lieutenant Johnson to call for a van.
Got a bomb in Building 1. We need both vehicle sally ports open.
He claims they have an emergency. The van must be brought around to the main sally port.
I'll stay back here with the doors for you.
Willie Turner has an appeal pending and volunteers to stay behind and guard the hostages. In the C-Pod control booth, Joe Giarratano, who also stays behind, pushes a button, opening the stairwell door. The rest of the conspirators, disguised as guards, troop downstairs to the loading dock. Lieutenant Johnson is no longer needed, and so the watch commander is imprisoned in the Building 1 stairwell. They leave behind one of their own in the control booth to open the door and let them out of Building 1. They lock Officer Smith in a closet. On their way out, the 6 escapees raid the room full of riot gear. Wearing helmets to further hide their identities, they place the television on a stretcher, throw a blanket over it, and exit Building 1. For months prior to the breakout, the inmates leaked a story about a bomb being built in C-Pod. So when James Briley warns the officer in charge of the van that they have a live explosive device and it might go off, the terrified officer completely believes him. Linwood Briley sprays their bogus bomb with a fire extinguisher, and it appears to be smoking. The escape has taken less than 2 hours to execute. And now, 6 vicious killers are roaming free.